Hey guys, it's Shaylin. I'm here today with another video. So today is another episode of Recent Reads. This is a series where I review the last 10 books that I read. It's pretty chill. I know I uploaded one of these pretty recently, but I've just been reading a lot lately and I'm a little behind on these videos. So these are books that I read from like the very end of July to the end of August, so it was really only about a month. To me, this is a very random group of books. Like, it might not seem random to you, but to me it's very random. Last year I spent like half the year trying to get through my entire TBR, so I didn't buy any books the later half of 2019 to get my TBR down to 0 books. My goal with that was to be more intentional with how I was reading. So instead of having like 30 unread books, I would just like only accumulate a few at a time. So I was always reading and kind of seeking out books I was most interested in, and that was great. It worked. I enjoyed more of what I was reading, and then it kind of got away from me. And I realized a couple months ago that I'd accumulated a good number of books, so I've been trying to get that down again. And so a lot of these books, not all of them, but a lot of them, are books I've owned for a while and I just kept not gravitating towards. So I kind of was trying to just get through them because I bought them and I want to read them. But these were just books I just kept continually, like I bought them and they just kept sitting. Not that they're bad or that I didn't want to read them, but they're just books I kept not gravitating toward. The first book that I read is actually one I was pretty excited to read, and it was The Best Bad Things by Katrina Carrasco. This book is very cool. It has a very cool plot. So we follow the protagonist, Alma, and she works for like a private women's detective agency in the West Coast. It's like in Washington state. In the 1880s, and she's investigating an opium smuggling ring because some of the opium has gone missing and she's trying to figure out what happened to it. She's like cross-dressing as this dude named Jack to go undercover and like figure out what happened to this opium. It's pretty awesome. I liked a lot of things about this book, but there were some major drawbacks for me. But there were still some aspects that really shone. For me, the main thing is Alma as a character. She's just awesome. Like, she's just the most awesome character that I've ever read about. This isn't what made her character well written, but one thing you don't get very often when it comes to historical fiction is just like escapist queer rep. Alma is living her best bi life, and she's like maybe gender fluid. I don't know, that's not canon, but I think you could definitely read her that way and make a pretty strong case for it. And none of these things ever cause her burden or conflict. She's just out there living her best life. She's very comfortable with herself. She's very comfortable with her sexuality and her gender. Kind of rare that you can just get like nice, pure escapist representation, especially in historical fiction. It's kind of rare to find a character where it's like her identities are all explored, but not as a bad thing. We love to see it. I loved the character. Alma is just awesome. In my notes, I literally wrote as a note, she is also very sexy and awesome. Just saying. She is. I also love the prose style in this book. There's this like punchy, electric style that's like razor sharp, and she uses like sentence fragments quite effectively in a way that I hadn't really seen before. It's like so visceral, and it really, especially paired with like this style of storyline, which is really gritty. There were a lot of things that I liked and a lot of things that really shone here, but unfortunately there were also a few drawbacks, and for me it was the plot. This is a more plot-driven narrative, but I wish it had been more character-driven, not because I prefer character-driven novels, but because I think the more character-driven moments were the strongest. And for me at least, I felt that the plot, it had so many twists that it got boring. It's a pretty fast-paced plot, but it gets so kind of like plans within conspiracies, within reveals, within conspiracies, within plans, that I lost track of what was happening, and it didn't feel like the stakes were really escalating or tension was escalating. It was just kind of like whiplashing you through like twist to twist to twist, to the point that I kind of stopped caring about it. There are so many characters and connections that I kind of lost track. It was kind of too fast-paced for its own good, to the point that like it was going so fast, like I fell off the back of the truck a mile back. I would die to see this adapted to screen. This would make an amazing like limited series. Honestly, you could stretch this into like 5 seasons if you got to. Send her on another case in season 2, I don't know, but this would be amazing on screen. I think all of the things that were flaws here wouldn't be an issue on screen. There's this like super visceral, engaging, gritty world that would be so visual. The character would be awesome on screen. All the characters, it's a super cool cast. Everything that's a detriment in a novel would work well on screen. It was Netflix, get on this. You need to. This would be amazing. I don't think it's ever gonna happen because I think this is kind of an obscure book. And that's the tragedy of my life. So the next book that I read also had a lot of conflicting feelings on, and it was Gold Fame Citrus by Claire Vaye Watkins. So this is an apocalyptic novel where basically there's like this terrible drought in California that has created this like sandstorm, giant dune sand mass that is just like slowly engulfing more and more of the United States. And it's created a ton of refugees who are known as Mohabs who can't leave, and there's like no water and they can't grow food, and it's all bad. And we follow this couple named Luz and Ray, and they find a stray child who's just wandering around in the apocalypse, and she doesn't seem to have parents, so they take her in. I have many conflicting feelings on this. The thing about this is that it has really weird but like delightfully creative premising and details. Like there are so many parts of this that are like so vibrant and cool and interesting from a creativity standpoint. Like I was reading this and I was like, the author is so creative. Like this is just creative, it's inventive, it's quirky, it's really cool. Like there's this cool like apocalypse cult, and like, you know, that's my shit. The writing is lovely. I like the writing style a lot. It's also very creative, but the characters were so underwhelming. I felt nothing for any of them because none of them felt like real people. They all felt kind of like just cardboard cutouts. None of them felt developed at all. And so the story ended up feeling quite clinical. There was nothing for me to invest in because I did not care about the characters. And so all of this really cool creative premising that would otherwise, I think, have been so exciting and to read fell flat because I didn't have any emotional connection to the people. And it's not hard for me to relate to a character, but they were so underdeveloped. They didn't feel like people. They didn't have that like spark of life at all. And it's too bad because I think if the characters had been stronger, I probably would have adored this because it's really got some really quirky, interesting, engaging elements and writing. But without strong characters, the foundation just was not there for me. So the next book that I read is quite a unique one. Flights by Olga Tokarczuk. This is translated from Polish, and it's won like everything. It won the Nobel Prize, the National Book Award, the Man Booker International. This is one I was pretty excited to read. I had bought this for a very specific purpose. Once upon a time, I had a cross-continental travel planned. Shaylin was going on a trip, and then a week before my flight departed, this thing called lockdown happened. So I didn't go, but I'd bought this book specifically to read on the plane because it was long, and it was going to be a very long flight, and it was also thematically appropriate. So then I ended up not going on that trip, and then I ended up just kind of not reading this for some reason. It's very hard to say whether this is a novel or a short story collection. I would call it a novel, but structurally it's a short story collection, but to me it feels more like a novel. This book is made up of a bunch of interlinking stories and vignettes. Some of them are very short, like a paragraph or a page. Some of them are like 20 pages and they're more of a full story. Some of them are in several parts that recur throughout, and they all kind of create this like, it's like a braided novel, kind of, is what it feels like. You get this feeling of movement as you traverse the vignettes and the stories and how, as they weave together in a way that to me a short story collection wouldn't do, which is why to me this feels like a novel, because there's a forward progression, forward motion of a larger arc across all of the stories, even in a way that like an interlinked collection wouldn't do. A lot of the like shorter meditations almost read like prose poems. I really enjoyed them. And then some of the longer pieces read like short stories. Almost feels more like a very long poem. Like structurally, I feel like it's like if you blew up a poem to be 500 pages or 400 pages, you might get this. It's not like there are different stories, it's more like there are different stanzas. Kind of moving and flowing from idea to idea more like you would from stanza to stanza, or line to line than you would from chapter to chapter in a novel, or you would from short story to short story in a collection. Very excellent example of unity of form and concept, as we see things like movement, transformation, and flight kind of shown through narrative structure. The next book that I read is The Vine That Ate the South by J.D. Wilkes. So I picked this up because The Vine That Ate the South is a reference to kudzu. And if you know anything about my writing, you know how I feel about the kudzu plant. It's my favorite thing. I've written a story all about the kudzu, and so that's like the only reason why I picked this up, is because it's about kudzu. Literally, that's all it took to sell me on this book. I really didn't like this though. This is kind of like a southern gothic tale. I have to read the back because I don't really remember. There's like a ton of weird stuff. It's basically just like the main character and a friend of his going on this weird journey to find this like House of Kudzu, where apparently a couple was like eaten by kudzu and they're trying to find it, and there's a ton of weird shit along the way. What does it say? Vampire cults, shrunken heads, time is immaterial. Seems pretty awesome, right? I wasn't a huge fan. This is a book that has so many cool ideas and just felt so mediocre. Points for very cool concepts, fun prose, and of course for kudzu. I did not care about the characters literally at all, either of them. And so very similar to in Gold Fame Citrus, but I actually enjoyed Gold Fame Citrus more because I could appreciate the writing more. The characters were just quite weak. And it's also very jumbled and jarring structurally that all of the events feel very non-cohesive. Like things would happen and it just felt random. It didn't feel like an escalation of events or like a structure. It just kind of felt like random things happening that I did not care about. So then I read a short story collection, Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez. I picked this up because it was recommended to me multiple times. Because I like Samantha Schweblin, I would like this book. Both Enriquez and Schweblin, they're both Argentinian authors. They're like contemporaries of each other, and they both write in this like dark kind of horror tone. Like they have a similar tone to their stories, and I definitely see it. If you like Samantha Schweblin, you would probably like this, and vice versa. I really did like this collection. There's some very dark stories in here. Warning, some of them are very disturbing. The first story in this book is so disturbing, and there are so many disturbing children in this book. Not in like a horror movie creepy girl standing in a creepy house, just like, I don't know, there's a lot of like violence against children. Like the first story is just like really disturbing. And it's rare that I feel genuinely disturbed by a story, but some of the stories in here really are unsettling and gruesome. It's very tense, creepy, unnerving, definitely has that like gothic kind of feel, and you know, all the stories very tense in that like overwhelming, enveloping way that is almost like claustrophobic. To me, just like the stories definitely started to blur together and lose their impact because they're all very similar in tone. So throughout the middle, they definitely blurred together. But there was definitely a lot that I liked about this collection. So the next book that I read is The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. This is one of the few books, this is one of the 2 books that I had bought recently, and that wasn't just like one that had been sitting on my shelf for like 87 years. So I was actually looking forward to reading this. This is set in Florida, kind of like at the height of the civil rights movement. We follow a teenager named Elwood. He's very idealistic, he has a very strong sense of justice, and he ends up being like wrongfully accused of stealing a car and being sent to this like brutal reform school called Nickel. He's like our window into this world, but then the story definitely expands to follow multiple other characters, specifically a friend of his that he meets there named Turner. It starts very zoomed in, but the scope becomes quite large as the book goes on. Writing here is really straightforward, but like very exemplary, like I think a great example of a strong, clean style. This is a pretty fantastic book with pretty exemplary writing and some pretty gut-wrenching moments. It's hard for me to explain why it wasn't a total home run for me. Like, you know, sometimes you read a book and you're like, I just don't know how to explain how I feel about this. I think maybe it's just that there were parts that kind of dragged. Partly it was because the scope was a little unfocused. Like, we started with Elwood, but we kind of lost him throughout the middle as we flowed through multiple characters' perspectives. Maybe lost a sense of connection throughout that unfocused portion. Maybe, I don't know, I'm kind of just spitballing here. So after this I read a book of poetry that I borrowed, so I don't have it, but it was Space Struck by Paige. This was lovely. I really like this. It's very like crisp, clever, poignant. You ever read a line and you just go like, oh, of course. This book had a lot of those lines. Really good use of negative space. Like maybe I was thinking of that in particular because of the title, but that's just something that I felt, this strong awareness of the negative space and the space around the words as well as just the words. The author is able to find absurdity in their own anxiety, which feels very relatable to me, but is a hard thing to express sometimes. I definitely felt like this book, it feels very shy. Like the poems feel very soft-spoken, and yeah, there's a shyness to them. And then I listened to Paige Lewis, the author, on the Verses podcast, and they are like the most soft-spoken person on this earth. I think that that conveyed through their poetic voice. So the next book that I read, I also wasn't a huge fan of, and this one may have been my fault, and it was The Orphan of Saltwinds by Elizabeth Brooks. This is one of those books that was recommended to me a few times, and then I just ordered it on impulse because sometimes you're in quarantine and you just order books without really remembering, and then they arrive and you're like, wait, I bought that. I don't think I am really the target audience, I'll be honest. This book follows a young orphan named Virginia. She arrives at this house called Salwin's in like a marsh, and I don't know, it's set in like the 19th century. She's kind of becomes like an observer of her adoptive parents, and then there's also a timeline set in the present. I think it's kind of meant to be very like, kind of like Jane Eyre-esque, where it's kind of like that like very atmospheric, bleak, but kind of cozy, like historical kind of vibe. This book is really atmospheric. I will give it that. The prose is lovely. The story just did not really intrigue me. It's very rare that I read a book and I'm like, I'm just not interested by this plot line. I just wasn't really interested by the plot line that we got, which is so weak of me. Like, that's so weak. Like, that's just on me. I think this book is really meant to be kind of like, not a play into in like a satirical or subversive way, but like maybe an homage to these kind of like classics like Jane Eyre, which aren't really something that I really read. So maybe if you really enjoy those types of books, you are the target audience for this, but I don't think I am the right target audience for this. And I don't know, the storyline I wasn't that interested by, but the writing is nice. So is it my fault that I didn't like this? Yes, it's my fault. So then we have another book of poetry. This was also one of the books that I had bought recently and was actually really excited to read, and I loved it. It was American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin by Terrance. So a while ago, last fall, I was taking a poetry class, and we were looking at sonnets, and we read a sonnet from this book in class. A little while ago I started thinking about it, and I was like, oh man, that sonnet was really cool. I want to read the rest of the book. But I couldn't find any mention of it in my notes, and I'm graduated, so I don't have access to my courses anymore. So stupid me didn't write it down. And so then I couldn't remember who the author was or what the book was called. All I could remember is that it was a book where all of the poems have the same title and they're all sonnet. I knew I would know as soon as I saw it, and I knew we'd read it on the New Yorker. So I just went through all the sonnets on the New Yorker, which I don't have a New Yorker subscription, so I had to open like an incognito tab so it wouldn't know that I'd used up my free articles. And I just looked through all the sonnets on the New Yorker until I found it, and I was like, that's it. And then I immediately ordered the book. I didn't do this with Space Trip because I didn't have the copy with me. I'm gonna do this new thing where I don't try to describe what poetry is about because I'm so bad at it, and I'm just gonna read the back. So, tracing the fault lines of race, gender, and political oppression with a singular passion and wit, this is the astonishing new sequence from award-winning poet Terrance Hayes. 70 poems which swerve at will between touching domestic visions, tributes to the fallen, and blistering denunciations of the enemies of the good. So this is a book of sonnets. Now you may be saying, that sounds terrible. I don't want to read sonnets. Hear me out, because this is incredible. This is one of the best books of poetry I've ever read. So these are, I think, 70 sonnets, all with the same title. They're all called American Sonnet for My Past and Future Assassin. And the thing about this book is that Terrance Hayes did not just write 70 good sonnets. I mean, he did. He wrote 70 good sonnets. But he kind of like, I think, transcended what a sonnet is and like what the sonnet form is. In my opinion, sonnets are one of the hardest things to write. It's the hardest thing I've ever personally tried to write. I suffered writing a sonnet. I couldn't write one good sonnet in my lifetime, and he wrote 70 of them. I had never really appreciated sonnets. I actually hated them until I read this book. And I was expecting to like this because I knew I had liked the one that I'd read, but other than this, I don't like sonnets. I don't know, I don't really like form poetry. It can feel like rigid and inorganic, which is not what I really like. But this made me realize the power and the effect of the sonnet form because of the rhythmic quality. Also, like, they're all sonnets, but the range of this book doesn't feel repetitive at all, even though they're literally all the same form, all with the same title. This is a literary feat. It's a literary opus. It's amazing. I don't have anything else to say. So the final book that I read is a short story collection, St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves by Karen Russell. This is one of those books that I've literally been meaning to read for years, since like early 2018. The reason I hadn't picked it up is because I read Karen Russell's novel Swamplandia and it was good. I like her writing, but it wasn't my favorite. And so I guess I didn't feel a ton of draw to reading her collection, but I had read individual stories by her before and liked them. And I was like, this seems like something I would really like. and I'm really glad I read it because I actually really enjoyed this collection. This book is kind of like if you added together and took the average of Lauren Groff and Daisy Johnson. The last story, especially in the title story, it's gotta be one of my favorite stories I've ever read. It's amazing. It's definitely my favorite of the book. I also actually really liked the first story, Ava Wrestles the Alligator, which Swamplandia is an expansion of that story. Swamplandia kind of lost me, but I loved this story. I thought that it worked better in the short form. I really like Karen Russell's style. I really like her creativity. She's just this like clever use of magic. Not the last story, but later in the book, kind of like the second half of the book, there were a few I wasn't a huge fan of. These are really fun stories, and I definitely plan to read her other collections because she has like 2 more collections. So she really does actually like maximize on her concepts. There are a lot of collections I've read where I read the back and I'm like, these all sound awesome, super cool concepts, and then they're kind of underwhelming, but I feel like she actually really capitalized on the potential in all of her stories. So that's all I've got to say in this video. Let me know what you've read recently that's good so that when I get to the bottom of my TBR, I can check out your recs. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video.